Hi, I'm Susan Palumbo, and I run a wealth management practice at Robert W. Baird with my team in Houston and Austin, Texas. I joined Impact Austin to really make friends and get to know the nonprofit scene in Austin after I moved here 7.5 years ago. I immediately jumped into a grant review committee because while it was fine to join for 1 year if I was going to be involved for a long period of time, I had to really believe in the grant review process and the integrity of the overall granting system. We absolutely have a fiduciary responsibility to our members that our dollars are being used in the best possible way. And we also need to listen to the community about what their needs are. They're closest to the populations, they're closest to what's happening on the ground. And I think that having that balance has been really important. What I'm most excited about in terms of where the organization is going in the future is even more democratization. As we continue to pursue diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, it has been amazing when we've had nonprofit leaders, people who come from different life experiences around the granting table. It literally changes the dynamic. And many of those women that we got to know through the grant application process have since become members of the organization. Some of them are serving on our Strategic Advisory Council now to add more community voices to what we're talking about. Well, I think one thing that has made it easy for me to be involved in Impact Austin as a volunteer and as the past board president has been my employer. Baird was very, very interested in our team's volunteer work for Impact Austin. And they liked Impact Austin because of that dual volunteer as well as philanthropy component, which is part of the Baird model of funding organizations where their employees are actively volunteering. Our firm and our team and me individually, we just couldn't be happier with our association with Impact Austin, and I hope that you will share our enthusiasm for this great organization.
Hello, everyone. On behalf of Impact Austin, I'd like to welcome y'all to our second session of Discovery Days 2022, Building Trusting Relationships, our deep dive into trust-based philanthropy. My name is Carrie Maher. I'm an Impact Austin member, and I'm chair of the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Learning Subcommittee, which puts on events such as this and our equity series throughout the year. We appreciate you being here. I'd like to extend a special thank you to our Discovery Day sponsors, who you just heard from, our title sponsor, Baird, and our premium sponsor, C2C Media and FV Law. A couple reminders, if you can mark your calendar, we have our final Discovery Day session, which will be held on February 18th over the lunch hour. So put that on your calendar. You can find more information on impactaustin.org. We'll also be holding breakout sessions after this, so you can stay on the webinar for an opportunity to continue the discussion. Also, if you want to provide any Q&A, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So any questions we'll answer at the end of the session. Feel free to put those in the Q&A. And if you want links to resources or just a comment, you can put those in the chat box, which you'll see to the right of your screen. For those of you who aren't aware, Impact Austin is a collective women's giving circle. We're open to anyone who's female identifying and want to pool their resources to make a bigger impact in our community. Our mission is to cultivate and expand the knowledge, passion, and generosity of our members to make a positive impact by developing strong relationships and leveraging the power of collective giving. We are recording today's session, so you're going to be able to reference it later, and we'll be posting it on our webpage. And as we start today, we really wanted to ground ourselves in trust-based philanthropy. So we're going to kick off with a recap from Embracing Trust-Based Philanthropy. It was an event we held in the fall of 2020 when we were 6 months into the pandemic and we were continuing to explore the context of collective giving in that situation. So this is a breakdown from two industry experts, Pia Infanti, she's the co-executive director of the Whitman Institute, Trust-Based Philanthropy Steering Committee, and Dimple Appashandani, the executive director, General Service Foundation. And then it was moderated by our own Mita Kathari. So here are the highlights of their presentation on the core values, tenets, and practices of trust-based philanthropy.
The roots of trust-based philanthropy are very similar to your roots in collective giving, being in collaboration and partnership. One of trust-based philanthropy's purposes is to reimagine a culture of giving.
We believe that the people who are best positioned to make change are those that are impacted by the problems that they're trying to solve. We think that the wisdom and the leadership should come from those who are most impacted. And so trust-based philanthropy for us is about centering the grantees.
We know that less than 3% of all funding goes to Black, Indigenous, and Latino leaders of organizations. So while organizations may be serving those populations, we look specifically at who's in executive leadership and also who are on the boards of the organizations, because again, we're looking at power. So if that's a front lens, we hold that, and we also held for ourselves, we were looking for organizations with budgets of $1 million or less. And so we would proactively find partners through publicly held information. So our due diligence was on our side. It's called We Do the Homework. Our experiential understanding, if we have shared values, going back to Dimple's point, do we share values around the most important things, around equity, around humility, around listening to feedback of our constituents, having accountability to those communities. Just take it a few steps further, then we're now in a relationship that we think of as a relationship of learning, not a relationship of proof. So meaning we're in the relationship not to chalk up some metrics of impact on a report card and tally them and use that tally to then support some claims of our own impact or grade a partner for further funding. We're in a relationship of learning. Wouldn't we rather spend the time in relationship, conversation, and learning rather than behind our laptops reading proposals and reports? Like, isn't that a more appealing way anyway to live into the human dimension that we're all attracted to in this work?
And ask yourselves, are we is our application process set up this way because this is, how all funders do it? Or is it set up this way because this really helps the effectiveness and sustainability of our grantees?
We transitioned our board to one that is very diverse so that our eyes and ears and networks are all really diverse, and they're diverse in a lot of ways. This maybe speaks to the Giving Circle set of eyes when looking at applications. We have really diversified the set of eyes that refer in and that review. It's asking the people that we're helping, how do you want to be helped? And I can guarantee you 1,000,000% of the time, they're not going to say, can you please create another structure for us to compete in to get dollars we need to pay our staff?
We use trust-based approaches because we urgently want our grantees to be powerful. And so in the context of that power imbalance, we're intentional about not wanting to hoard additional power. What that looks like is things like having our default grant be a general operating support grant as opposed to a project support grant. When your grants are a tremendous amount of work, not just for us as funders, but more importantly for our grantees, right? They're having to come back every year and ask us for funding and having to sort of go through the cycle of proving their expertise and their worth every year. And so what we have moved towards is defaulting towards 2 to 3 year grants, which gives grantees this longer runway. And when I think about the power that that gives them, it gives them the power to imagine more long-term change and actually move towards it, because they don't have to kind of break everything down into like what can be accomplished in a year.
We can do inclusive design in 1,000 different ways. But if, again, we go back to Dimple's point, the folks at the table are not the ones directly experiencing that issue and directly trying to counteract that in their actual lived experience, whether, you know, on whatever scale we're talking about and whatever issue we're talking about, then we're not getting to shifting the power dynamic. So it's not that trust-based philanthropy is about sort of blindly and being undiscerning in our relationships. In fact, I say no a lot more than I say yes in trust-based philanthropy, because if we're not completely transparent, the opaqueness of our intentions can be misread in about 1 million different ways. If anyone wants to call themselves trust-based to their community, they're going to want to be very transparent about what they mean by that.
We are excited to share our experience with others. So it's not, you know, we share it because I feel like it's both made us better grant makers, but it's made our grantees able to do their work in a way that's more supported.
And I think what trust-based philanthropy and anything that questions our own individual embodiment of power or our institutional decisions of power, there's going to be some discomfort in examining that and interrogating that and being truthful about that. But I think we believe that if we're able to do that, and we're able to do that with a spirit of real service and compassion and intention, then we can maybe add to the climate that we'd like to have in this country, which is I don't think we want to be so close together and so far apart.
We're so fortunate to have such incredible resources in this field, and we'd like to go ahead and introduce the panel that's with us here today to continue this discussion, this dialogue. Lorene Phillips is inaugural co-chair of Impact Austin Strategic Advisory Council, and we are launching our council in the fall here, or we launched it last year and kicking off and continuing that this year. Lorene's going to be doing a fireside chat with 2 leaders in the field of trust-based philanthropy and collective giving. We have Shaady Salehi. She's head of the TrustBased Philanthropy Project, and Tyeshia Wilson, Director of Engagement for Philanthropy Together. Lorene Phillips has a long-standing career. She's been working in human resources for Fortune 500 companies, including IBM and Dell. She's served on the board of directors, including Austin Humane Society, House of Hope, Communities for Recovery, Impact Austin, and most recently, Drive a Senior Central Texas. Shaady Salehi is the director of TrustBased Philanthropy Project. She's worked in various social sectors using strategic communications to galvanize coalitions, establish legacies, generate buy-in, and strengthen networks. Shaady is a 2014 Aspen Institute Fellow and sits on the board of Let It Ripple, a nonprofit that experiments with collaborative filmmaking for the common good. Tyeshia Wilson, Director of Engagement Philanthropy Together, is a fellow Texan. Tyeshia Wilson is a spirited entrepreneur, philanthropist, and social good advocate. She founded the Social Giving Experience, a social impact consulting agency that specializes in strategic engagement, philanthropy, and events to drive social change. She serves as a member of several civic organizations, including the Heritage Giving Fund, one of the first African American giving circles in Texas that funds Black-led nonprofits serving Black women and girls. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lorene.
Thank you, Carrie. It is my pleasure to be with you today to give you an update on the Impact Austin Strategic Advisory Council, as well as serve as a moderator for this panel discussion. The Strategic Advisory Council for Impact Austin was kicked off in September of 2021. And there are two of us who co-chair this council. Becky Austin, my fellow Impact Austin classmate, and I have the pleasure of chairing the council. The goal of the council is to connect Impact Austin with community leaders and solicit input, as well as strengthen our diversity for membership and our diversity in the grant making process. We also want to share expertise and the diverse knowledge that the people who are the boots on the ground bring to the table to grantors in how they need to take a look at organizations that have need, etc. We want to share the connections and the resources with our colleagues in the nonprofit space. And also the council has an objective to make recommendations to the Impact Austin Board of Directors on strategic and outreach initiatives. Now, the council members are not required to be members of Impact Austin or to meet our membership requirements. We assembled a cross-section of 26 nonprofit and community leaders for the inaugural group. And we had a very, very good discussion at the first meeting and a lot of interaction, a lot of exchange of information. We meet quarterly. We have had 2 meetings to date, the first one in September and the second meeting in January of 2022. During the first meeting, the council members identified 4 focus areas that are affecting nonprofits in the greater Austin area. Those are racial equality, economic equality, capacity building, and funding. And what we are in the process of doing now is distilling those issues down to manageable, actionable objectives that we can work on together as a council in the greater Austin area and have an impact. And I will just tell you that I believe trust-based philanthropy has been given a name, but some of these principles we were acting on within Impact Austin for some time before it had the trust-based philanthropy title. So what is trust-based philanthropy? It addresses the inherent power imbalance between funders, nonprofits, and their communities. And this is at a very high level. I am no expert. You're going to hear from the experts here in a few minutes. It's built on a relationship of learning versus a relationship of proof of concepts. That means it's not based on, okay, how many metrics do you have to validate or justify your grant making? It's also an opportunity to solicit and listen to feedback to improve the grant making process. And I believe that the Strategic Advisory Council for Impact Austin is doing just that. We are soliciting that feedback and then taking action on it to improve our grant making process. Trust-based philanthropy is also committed to building relationships on transparency, dialogue, and mutual learning. The organization learns as well as the grantee. So with that, and again, that's just a very, very high level view of what it is. And I think that you will agree once we get done with this presentation that it is very much a part of what we need to be doing as nonprofit funding and for grantees as well as grantors. Okay, so with that, we will move to the panel discussion between Shaady and Tyeshia. I would like to start with the question and having you ladies discuss, how do you communicate the trust-based philanthropy principles to given circles that you support?
Do you want to take that one first, Tyeshia?
Yeah, sure. So yes, first off, thank y'all again. I'm super excited. This is a conversation and just a topic that I'm very passionate about, and my organization, Philanthropy Together, is strong advocates for. Giving circles like Impact Austin we're rewriting the rules of philanthropy, what it means to be a philanthropist. Giving circles themselves are really working in a very progressive way to democratize and to diversify philanthropy. It is Giving Circles are truly people-powered philanthropy. It's power back to us. And that's exactly the core principle of what trust-based philanthropy is centered on. It really is rooted in power sharing and forcing all of us to envision and to think through from a funding perspective what that looks like. So our organization, Philanthropy Together, we exist solely for Giving Circles. We literally train hundreds of individuals, philanthropists, how to start them, how to launch them. And then for existing Giving Circles like Impact Austin, we really train them how to sustain themselves. So that being said, our training program, we have a signature program, it's called Launchpad. And throughout Launchpad, where we are training people from A to Z how to start a Giving Circle, we root trust-based philanthropy smack in the core of that. It's very important because for a lot of philanthropists, they are, who have not traditionally viewed themselves as philanthropists. This is very new. They're new, they're grant makers, so to speak. So we have to train them early on what trust-based philanthropy is, and we do just that. And how we do this and how we show up is throughout our programming, we root our participants in the 6 key principles of what trust-based philanthropy is. And Shaady, I know this is your jam, and those 6 key principles are exactly what we've received those from TrustBased Philanthropy Project. And so we train them and we root them on the why it's so important, how they can launch their Giving Circles being rooted in these core values of trust-based philanthropy, which is power sharing, as I mentioned, equity, humility, transparency, collaboration, curiosity, all of those things. And throughout the training, while we provide them with this roadmap, y'all, of what it looks like and how they can practice it, how they can lead with trust, how to center themselves within relationships, how to collaborate with humility and curiosity and distribute power. So as an organization, we not only practice trust-based philanthropy in all of our programs, but that training program, which is through Launchpad, is so important. And trust-based philanthropy is something that we advocate because we want more grant makers to practice it. That's the only way that we're going to balance out the funding for these. Oftentimes, as y'all heard, only 3% of the funding go to Black, Indigenous, and Latinx organizations. And so it's necessary that all of us as grant makers, as philanthropists, that we all think through and be very strategic and meaningful as to how we show up and give our gifts. And Giving Circles do just that. We do just that and we learn. And I'll pass it to you, Shaady, to elaborate more. Sorry, I get passionate and talk about it. I can talk about it.
No, I love that. Thank you. Thank you, Tyeshia. I wanted to give space for Tyeshia to share first because she works really at, in that hub of donor circles. And just a little context about the TrustBased Philanthropy Project. We launched in January 2020 with the mission of contributing to a culture shift in the philanthropic sector, away from this very traditional compliance-oriented culture that has really come to be the norm in philanthropy. And a lot of that has come from institutional giving, like private foundations, corporate foundations, family foundations, that have really instituted a misperception of what's best practice. And that has created a lot of extra hoops, applications, organizations have to prove their worth. A lot of the traditional structures that get perpetuated in the philanthropic sector are really grounded in and no one's really calling it this, but they're grounded in a initial sense of mistrust, where nonprofits have to prove their worth just to get their foot in the door to submit a proposal. And that suspicion that drives a lot of philanthropy has become kind of normalized in the sector. And there's a real opportunity, though, in a donor circle context, as Tyeshia was sharing. It is inherently about redistributing power. It's people coming together who have resources, looking for opportunities to redistribute their resources collectively where they're needed. So inherently, there is an element of democracy and redistributing power just in the whole concept of a donor circle. And we've seen more of these donor circles emerge in response to COVID. Individual donors coming together to pool resources, to support communities at this urgent time of need, institutional funders coming together to figure out, how they could move money as quickly as possible to get them to the front lines where people really needed them. And there's been this kind of shift ever since we've been living in this pandemic, and understanding that we can't be sitting in our comfortable office chairs, assuming we know where money needs to go and how that money should be spent. There's multiple crises going on. We've got climate crisis happening right as we speak. I know a lot of you are living that right now. We've got racial injustice that has pervaded our society for centuries and continues to. We've got a pandemic that we're still digging out of. So there's all these factors. So, one of the core elements of trust-based is to recognize that if we really want to strive to address these challenges that we're dealing with in our society, we can't let those decisions fall in the hands of a few. We must listen to those who are experiencing and living these issues. And we have to lead with a sense of trust that those who live the issues are best positioned to determine what the solutions are and how they want to go about it. So I think that the thing is, oftentimes you look at a lot of even individual donors, even friends of mine, who might reach out and say, oh, I want to donate to this cause. There's always this kind of cultural component of which ones are, I've literally heard this from friends who, want to donate $25. Which organization is the least shady? I mean, that to me just perpetuates this idea that nonprofits are out there, committing crimes left and right. But the reality is people who lead on these issues are passionate, they care. Oftentimes it's because of something personally that's happened to them that they're leading on these issues. And for us to even perpetuate the sense of, these folks are out there trying to extract money is kind of crazy, because they're actually, the nonprofit, I used to run a nonprofit myself. This is not a lucrative sector. People don't do this work to make a lot of money. They do it because they're passionate about the causes. So I think my message to those of you part of donor circles is, let's not lean on these old ways of giving and these old ways of structuring the way philanthropy should operate, because they come out of this distrust-based, suspicion-based kind of thinking that has really become ingrained in our culture. How can we actually shift the way we look at this work and see the value and the leadership of those who are doing this work, rather than thinking of them as these needy supplicants that need a handout? Because that's what's been perpetuated in our psyche, in our culture, and the way we even see the dynamics between people with money and people who are doing that work on the ground. Anyway, I'll pause there. I've taken up a lot of time, so I'll hand it back to you, Lorene.
Okay, thank you. As you have heard earlier in the presentation, our members have had exposure to the fundamentals of trust-based philanthropy. However, the feedback that we've heard is that many understand the concept, but have questions about how do you tactically and actively implement trust-based philanthropy principles in our grant applications, outcomes, and decision-making. So would each of you comment on how do you help us bridge that gap between understanding what it is and tactically being able to implement the principles in the grant-making process?
That's such a great question. And the tactical piece is the most practical, that's where the action happens. And so one of the, I want to lift up first that there are, as Shaady mentioned, that disruptive wave that's happening within philanthropy by us leaning into this trust-based philanthropy is something that that people are very passionate about, and it's happening. So there's tons of big foundations like Whitman Foundation and the Ford Foundation, and even giving circles that are really moving and doing it right that way. And so first, I want to just lift up a couple of organizations or even giving circles, so to speak, that that folks can consider, and just to take a look at how they are practicing trust-based philanthropy. One of the organizations is Collective 365, and I'll drop their website in the chat. But basically, one of the most tactical ways and how we should think about utilizing trust-based philanthropy is, one, giving multi-year unrestricted funding. That is something that Collective 365 does. It's also a practice that my giving circle does, Heritage Giving Fund. We are a group of Black women that are unapologetic about allocating funding to Black female-led organizations. And so, because going back to that statistic, we know that they're traditionally underfunded. So what that looks like is give multi-year unrestricted funding. Don't put restrictions on their funding. That's one way. Trust them to do the actual work. Trust these nonprofits, as Shaady mentioned, that know exactly, they are often from these communities that they are serving. So they know exactly what they need. Trust them with that. Do the homework. Number two, we should put the onus is on us as grant makers to do the homework, not on the grantees. For us to the work should not be on the grantees. From a grant maker perspective, we should research their priorities, research about the issues that these nonprofits are working to address, research and share publicly about the giving circle, about the nonprofit. Do the homework. Another tactical way is to streamline and simplify your paperwork. Collective 365, or even just your grant application process. Think about that. What are very simplified ways and how we can reduce the barriers for our grantees to get the funding? Do you really need a 3-4 page grant application? Do you? Or do you really need all of those reporting requirements? Really take a look at the process, at your grant making process. As we all know, a lot of these small grassroots nonprofit organizations, they're small, y'all. They are very small. So you have the executive director that's also, she's writing grants. She's in the back sorting diapers to distribute out. Like they are running off a very limited capacity. So that is one tactic that I would encourage all of us to consider, is how our processes, what does that look like? And what barriers are we getting in the way that's preventing these awesome nonprofits from receiving the funding? And then a couple of other practices is, being transparent with how we respond to them, and also going beyond the dollar, really thinking about how we're just distributing, giving them the funding, and then what else could they possibly use? As I mentioned, that a lot of them have they need help. They are operating off a very short staff and things like that. So like my giving circle and many other giving circles, we go beyond the dollar. We stress the importance of going beyond the dollar. What does that look like? Being an advocate, helping them to fundraise beyond the dollar out. My giving circle operates a program, a leadership development program for our grantees and the ones that don't get our funds, so that we can train them and help them on how to build their boards, fund development practices. Like we literally host webinars that helps them beyond the dollar in other capacities that they might need help with. So I'll stop there, Shaady. But there are many practical, very low hanging fruit ways and how we can all practice trust-based philanthropy. And yeah, I'll let you share a little bit more, Shaady, sorry.
No, that's great, Tyeshia. I think the only thing I would add to that was essentially the 6 principles. I dropped a link in the chat that gives a little bit more there, but I think all those examples that Tyeshia shared are spot on. The only thing I'd say is that there's no legal requirement that you have to give project restricted grants, and then you have to have all this detailed narrative and financial reporting and applications. None of that is legally required. I think a lot of this stuff that we think are again, like it's been called best practice in the past. We think, that because it's been happening for so long, there's this expectation or this misunderstanding that that's the best way to do it. That's the legal requirement. That's the way to be the most buttoned up in the approach. And actually, you know, the baseline legal requirements for charitable giving is that an organization has to be have 501c3 status or be a project of a 501c3. There's also ways to give to individuals, and I'm not going to get into the weeds on that, but there's also ways to do that too within the legal requirements. So I would kind of dispel that fear of like, oh, is it bad practice to not have like a rigorous application process? Is it bad practice to not collect financial reports? No, none of that is legally required. So just kind of, you know, and I have a guide about that we created with a nonprofit attorney to really address some of these concerns that tend to come up. So if you free up a lot of those restrictions, if you free up all that paperwork time, then you actually have a lot more time to be in community, to listen, to learn, to give that support beyond the check like Tyeshia was talking about. It creates more space to be in genuine relationship. Another tip I would suggest is, you know, a lot of times funders, when they're kind of courting a potential nonprofit that they want to support, that can drag on in that getting to know you period of time. That is unfunded time for that nonprofit. So they're investing their time, their energy to show up, to have the meeting, to basically try to win over the affection of that particular donor. And that can drag on for a while. I mean, with institutional funders, it can drag on 2-3 years. And that's been my experience in the past. That's not an exaggeration. So even if you're interested in getting to know a prospective grantee partner, if you're interested in like, oh, maybe I want to figure out if this is a fit, if there's values alignment here, even giving an initial small unrestricted investment to honor their time, just to be in relationship, could be a good way of just beginning that relationship and acknowledging and respecting that it takes time. And like Tyeshia was painting that picture, you've got these nonprofit leaders that are leading their teams, coming up with their strategic vision, leading their marketing in their blog, changing their kids' diaper in the back, you know, doing all these things and having to fundraise to keep their staff employed. So all of that costs money. So even if you think like, oh, I'm just asking for lunch, you know, every few months just to check in, that time should be honored. So that's one small step that I would encourage and invite as you engage in new relationships with prospective grantees.
Well, thank you for those insights. I want to shift now to ask you to share some examples of where you have seen trust-based philanthropy work very well, and in your opinion of how it benefited the organization as well as the grantee as well as the grantor.
Yeah, so I shared a few already, and but I did want to lift up what they are doing well. One of the things that I love about Collective 365, which is a giving circle that supports individuals. Shaady, I know you don't want to go down that hole, but yeah, you have some giving circles and funders that give out funding to individuals, and so as well as to nonprofit organizations. So one of the things that I really like what they do is they have a very simplified grant application. You have 3 ways. They provide 3 options for you to submit your grant application, whether it's written, whether they do a phone screening, or the grantee can submit a video to talk about their needs. That is a best practice. That's something for all of us to think about, a very innovative, simple, like to get to the root, at least to get to the core of what it is that you need from your grantee. So in thinking about those barriers, that's we got to remember how to be innovative and fun and use technology and all the things that we're already using right now anyway. How can we bring those into our grant making processes? We are seeing many giving circles that give, again, beyond the dollar. That is a huge best practice, y'all, because as I mentioned, not only does that give support to these nonprofit organizations in terms of their capacity, but that learning piece is very important because we all can learn from one another. So when we engage them beyond the dollar, rather that is hosting other events or to provide them the space to really talk about more about the issues that the nonprofit is serving, or giving our, as we like to mention, our 5 T's, our time, our talent, our testimony, our tithes, and our treasure. Bringing all of that into this space, going beyond the dollar, is a very good best practice for all of us as philanthropists to consider. What other ways can we show up and build that trust, to leverage our relationships, to do more good collectively together? And so those are just, very, that giving beyond the dollar, and just unrestricted and funding, and really being innovative and fun, and using the power of technology and as to how we engage our grantees and how we can simplify our process, to me, are some of the most very low-hanging ways in how we can immediately make a difference to the grantees and even within ourselves. And I also would just lift up how much, because this is new, it's not even new, trust-based philanthropy, because this is disruptive to the traditional philanthropy way of how funding is allocated. I think for all of us, one thing for all of us to remember is that we're advocates for this. The more that we use our testimony, that is a best practice with this work, because it's something that some funders are not used to. They might, some people are not open to change. So how we, the ones that are advocating for trust-based philanthropy and practicing it in our work, how we are sharing these best practices, exactly what we're doing right here. These conversations are so important, y'all. It's so important for us to talk about it and to share our testimony so we can bring more people into this fold that has this same mindset. So that is definitely a best practice for all of us to consider, of how we are all advocating for this movement. It is truly a movement. And so just showing up that way, I think, will really help us to get some funding into these organizations and get us out of the way.
Okay. Shaady, do you have any comments? I'm sorry.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I wanted to point out, I think both Lorene and Tyeshia have mentioned this. Trust-based philanthropy was named in the last, several years, but the practice is not new, because really the core of what we're talking about is taking a values-based approach, being power conscious, being equity-centered, being self-aware in that work. So that's something that's like the commonality. And there's a lot of what we're talking about might even sound like common sense to you, because it's just a human-centered way of being in relationship. But in terms of some of the benefits, really building upon some of Tyeshia's great points, people who practice in this way just feel a deeper sense of joy and connection to the work. It's, as Pia was saying in the video, it's way more interesting and fun to be in relationship than to be sitting behind a laptop reading grant proposals. So that's one big thing. I think the learning stance, the multi-year long-term relationships, creates a much bigger window for learning. When we box organizations into time frame, we don't get to see the full picture. We're literally just asking them to give us a picture of one corner of the bigger puzzle that they're working on. So we're, when we're in relationship like this, we can see these bigger things of like, oh wow, like, unrelated to a specific project that you're supporting, you start seeing that bigger picture of what the social change work looks like. And as Lorene shared, that helps you be a more informed funder to figure out where resources are needed. But I'll give you a very specific example of how a trust-based approach has made an impact. In the city of Baltimore, the T. Rowe Price Foundation, financial institution, had a relatively new leader who came in after the murder of Freddie Gray. And he was charged with addressing some of the tensions and the violence and the economic inequities in Baltimore. And he came in and he decided, look, we're not going to decide as a financial institution what this community needs. We're not even going to say that we know what the focus of our money should be. Let's go and sit and listen to community meetings. Let's sit in the back of church meetings. Let's not even show up in these suits and let's just listen to what the community is talking about and what they need. And what came out of that listening series was not, oh, we need to address blight. Oh, we need to address violence. It was the lack of access to healthy fruits and vegetables. That was the thing that community residents needed. People were taking 3 buses to get an apple. I mean, so they're not ready to start talking about all this other stuff. It's like address some of these initial needs first, what the community needs. And that's where that foundation invested its resources. Let's increase access. Let's support community leaders in building and increasing access to fresh, healthy produce. And that has led to, that was several years ago, that has led to stronger community coalitions, that's led to better health outcomes for families, that's led to better education outcomes for kids. But again, we have to have some patience. We can't expect that if we come in and we give some grants for a few years that things are going to change overnight, because what we're talking about is also deeply systemic issues that are interrelated with all these other factors. So while there are some shifts happening, we got to also be patient and see and listen with our partners and continue to inform our strategies based on what the community is saying, because that is when change happens.
Thank you.
Ms. Lorene, I just want to, Shaady, thanks for lifting that up, because I think that that's very important, y'all. As we're talking about like, what are some best practices? Every community is so different. My community here in Dallas is very different than New York or in the Bay Area where Shaady is at. And so when we take the time, at the core of trust-based philanthropy is relationships. It's trust on both ends. It's a collaboration between the grantee and the grant maker. And when we make space to have those conversations, to get to know each other, to listen enough, your grantee, your mind as an organization, as a grant maker, will start spiraling literally on new ways and how you can quickly address these needs, how you can quickly tap into areas that you might not have known about if you didn't have that conversation. So I just want to lift that up, because that's so important, y'all, for us to do, is just to talk to our grantees and get away from this checkbook philanthropy where we're just writing them the check and that's it. They need more, they deserve more, we need more as grant makers, and that's going to help us to stay innovative and stay thinking through about ways and how we need to pivot to best serve the community and these awesome organizations. So I love that you mentioned that. Thank you.
Tyeshia, I'd actually like to piggyback that, because we've got 10 minutes left, and there was a question that kind of pertained to that I had, and that Judy McCarthy was talking about, that's post-grant. You know, when you talked about those 5 T's and going beyond the check, I think it has been commonplace, unfortunately, for grant makers to pass the check, and some are maybe hyper diligent about measuring the outcomes and the accountability of the organization, and others just pass the check on and there's not, you never hear from them again. How do you see that taking place with collective giving circles, those 5 T's being practiced after the check is cut, and without overwhelming them, to Shaady's point earlier about being sensitive to their time and efforts and all the other competing priorities that they have?
That's such a great question. When I think about my giving circle, and I have, because that's just a real example. We do the work. We do the work because we're, as a collective, we're about 57 members strong, and all of us have strengths, our unique areas. We have executives on our, as part of our giving circles. We have some fundraisers, experienced fundraisers. We have Marcom professionals. We have all the power of our collective, of our giving circle, in terms of just our strengths, professional areas, our ties, our connections. Our circle we get together and we literally think through, and once we think through as a collective on how we can divide and conquer in these areas to best serve these nonprofits. We do the work. So that beyond the dollar, that burden is not on them. We are hosting the events. We are reaching out to them saying, hey, we know that based off conversations, to Shaady point, off what we know about them, because we have relationships with our grantee. We know that Jim's, one of our grantees, was in need of a new, like a website or needed some support with getting the word out about their organization because they were so new. So then what did that look like? That looked like us on social media with sharing about their work. So the work is on us, y'all. Again, that goes back to us doing the work. That beyond the dollar is us supporting them in ways that is not burdensome to them, but if anything, it lifts them up, it encourages them. We energize our grantees to keep going. They are frustrated sometimes. You imagine all this time they've been receiving less than 3% of the funding, but they are showing up. They're doing the work. These people, these organizations are already doing the work. So we have got to go like, y'all, this is community. This is the village. We got to support them. We got to lift them up. We have to, but that beyond the dollar is on us. We have to do the work to the best of our ability as well. Cause I also know the giving circles we're volunteer red, and I have 5 kids and all of us are super busy too, but striking that balance of what we can do and then doing it as a collective and showing up. It's a win-win on both ends, and everyone is best served, and the community gets what it needs. They get the support they need, and it also engages our members to use to leverage their strength of their gifts and to serve in that way.
I appreciate that. Especially, I know we've got such engaged, passionate, intelligent women reviewing our grants and imagining the possibilities as we're updating our grant review process now, imagining the possibilities of what that looks like, from the beginning of the application, process to post check, I think this is so relevant to what we're going through right now. I mean, we're in the middle of one of our cycles. So thank you for that response, Tyeshia. Did you have anything to add to that, Shaady?
No, I thought that was great. I also, I responded to that question in the Q&A directly also. I think, I guess the only thing I would add or build upon is, we need to be cautious about an overly narrow conversation when we ask about, the direct correlation between the grant that was made and the impact that was seen. That's very challenging. We have to think about, oftentimes the scale of the work that nonprofits are dealing with is really, really big. So one $25,000 grant over a 12-month period is going to be very difficult to say that grant was able to accomplish this specific thing. It's just, if you sit back and really think about it, it's not really that realistic. So inviting bigger picture conversations about what are you learning? What do you want us to know about what you've learned over the last year? What are you excited about? What are you still struggling with? Like, those more expansive conversations can open up way more interesting insights about impact. You might hear something that wasn't, maybe even that nonprofit wasn't directly tying to the particular grant, but allows you to really understand the impact of the work in a way that's memorable, and that invites you in to continue to support over time. So some of it is just a bit of a frame shift, I would suggest.
Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you so very much. The last couple of questions I had have been answered as we were having the dialogue about organizations and what they can do and how they can support trust-based philanthropy. But I want to loop back to the principles of trust-based philanthropy. And one big takeaway for me has been the relationship building, the fact that it's a relationship of learning versus the proof of concept, and that, acknowledging the inherent imbalance in funders, nonprofits, and communities. And it's also an opportunity to solicit feedback and build upon that information to go forward. So one of the questions was going to be, how do we know when we've been successful? But I think that has been answered as you talked about some of the specific actions that we can do to move this needle forward. And again, I think it's been given a name, trust-based philanthropy, but I think some of the principles we've been kind of working on, maybe on an ad hoc basis for some time now. So thank you very much for your time and input to help us frame this notion of trust-based philanthropy. So thank you very much.
I do know we have 4 minutes left, and there's another question that actually came through, and there's two, so I want to make sure we try to get to them before we wrap up the call. Um, Callie Rourke had asked, with a membership of 400 to 500 women, how do we communicate what their collective giving has accomplished by a nonprofit that could be difficult to form a personal, individual relationship with? It seems like that would be challenging. Would one of you like to comment on that?
Shaady, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'm just reading it. I was just typing a response to the other question. So okay. What collective giving has accomplished? Oh, so is the question more just like when there's this scale and you're not able to be in close relationship? Is that the question? I just want to understand it.
Callie, does Callie have the ability to unmute Nicole? I gather that that's how I'm interpreting it too, Shaady, but I don't want to.
Okay, I'm unmuted. And
Yes.
basically, in the past, we've tied our metrics and our accomplishments basically on individual programs or capacity building or specific areas of focus. And so a rank and file member could point to a menu of nonprofits and say, we did this and we did that with our collective giving. So each woman, in a 500 member organization is kind of part of the whole. So I guess I'm looking for some type of guidance on how would you communicate the trust-based philanthropy outcomes to 500 individual women and make them all feel like they have a personal relationship, since that seems to be so important.
Thank you, Callie. That's really helpful. One of the biggest paradigm shifts that I would say trust-based philanthropy encourages is to rethink the learning. Some of the first questions to be asking is whether you are living those values and whether your grantee partners are having a positive experience. So that's the learning for accountability, like learning for accountability to the partners that are being supported. So one simple way is to assess the general satisfaction levels of the organizations that are supported. Are they, do they feel supported? Do they feel trusted? Are they able to do their work with less stress? And kind of inviting that, like that helps a community of donors to see, oh, wow, we are actually contributing to the health and wellness of the nonprofit ecosystem that we're supporting. And that you can feel really good about. Because if we're trying to make change, then these organizations that are doing that change work, they need to be healthy, they need to be sustainable, they need to be freed up to do the work. So if they genuinely are reporting back and saying, yes, we feel like we're able to do this better, we're able to retain our staff, things like that. And I'm happy, I'll share a sample conversation guide that's been used to do that kind of learning for accountability. That way you can learn, are we being good partners to the community? Are we being
I think that's an interesting suggestion. And what that would require would be almost like a net promoter score type survey of all of our grantees that would then come back to the membership and maybe part of the annual meeting or town hall meeting to tell them what difference they have made in the actual nonprofits as opposed to a particular programmatic area. Is that where we're going?
Yes, that's right. And I think also being open to learning about what could be improved upon. So not going in just looking for the really great nuggets that can help make everyone feel good, but also learning like, okay, we were great at this, but on this side, we can improve, and we're going to bring that into our strategy for next year. So it also becomes, yeah. Mm-hmm. I'll hand it back because I know we're over time.
Yeah, no, I know you're already answering the question. Is there anything that you wanted to say before I jump to one more question from the anonymous attendee about the corporate funding and ESG, or did you handle that?
I'm about to press send on my response, so I'm gonna zip it for now.
Okay. Well, this kind of is piggybacking Callie's question, and that was one that Christina had posted in the chat, which was how we can apply trust-based philanthropy within the financial review phase of the grant process. And I don't know if I don't think she shared this, but it's come up a lot in the last couple of years for our particular Giving Circle for Impact Austin. So we'd love to hear from you both about what we can do to really hone in on that during the financial review.
Yeah, so in evaluating your grant applications, one of the ways in how you all can really lean into trust-based philanthropy and equity is when we are reviewing these, like for transparent and clear financials, because that is something that we want to see, right, in our grantees. But trust-based philanthropy, flipping that might look like making grants relative to the size of the budget size of the organization. That is a very different way of how you would think through how the financials of the nonprofit or the grantee organization. Another piece will be when we have to remember, of course, we're centering equity, humility, that transparency within our grant review process, but getting a large piece of the grant making process is the decision making on us and how we are really looking at our RFP process, or how you're bringing in your members to kind of vet these organizations in other ways that are beyond the financial review piece. So that might look like their board membership, right? So I know a lot of grantees, they say, well, if the board members aren't giving, then that's a bad sign. Well, trust-based philanthropy says, no, it's not. What about, we have to trust, looking at the board membership might look like trusting the board in terms of their other things, other ways and how they are contributing, right? And so not just looking at the financial piece, which I know I used to be, I was a fundraiser. And so that was a huge piece. They're like, well, if the board isn't giving, that should knock them out. And so no, it is really trusting the leadership of the organization and pushing equity that way. Also looking at, their programs itself, right? So how powerful the programs are in connection with their mission. Well, trust-based philanthropy would say, well, we're going to focus on the organizations that align with your values and the issues that you're trying to serve as a grant maker. And so it really, we can't always just look at some of the traditional things that we have looked at in with the financial review, but really looking at our processes in a more equitable lens. Again, thinking about barriers. So it's going to be very unique for every different grant makers, but those are just practical ways. Definitely that one about making the grants that are relative to the budget size. That's so important, because as we're thinking about capacity for these grant makers, if their budget size is $100,000, then as opposed to like an organization that has $1 million, well, your $10,000 grant will probably do more and go a longer way and have more impact on the $100,000 budget organization than the $1 million. So it's just us really thinking through, and also their capacity. Can they handle a $10,000 grant if their budget size is smaller? So really leaning into that trust and being very intentional about how you all are reviewing and bringing equity, centering, reviewing your application through that equitable lens is a way that you can kind of move forward on that lens. Shaady, I don't know if you have anything.
No, those are all such great points. I think, not being so narrow, just focusing on the financials as the main indicator is really important. I really appreciate all those kind of bigger points of other things to look for. I think there's also some things that in the sector will, like if we see like, oh, this organization doesn't have any reserves, so they're kind of in a weak financial state, so it's not really worth the investment. That kind of thinking is very dangerous, because for smaller organizations, especially organizations led by Black and Brown leaders, there's just statistically the ability to build up those reserves partially due to distrust, partially due to lack of access, partially due to the fact that they might be smaller organizations that are not on the radar of the major donors. You know, that is a really dangerous thinking that actually really limits the growth and potential of those organizations. So just because an organization doesn't have financial reserves, first of all, because the sector tends to be so focused on project restricted grants, it's very difficult for nonprofits to generate their own reserves. And then statistically, if you look at it, Bridgespan and Echoing Green put out a study 2 years ago, and they found that organizations led by white leaders have unrestricted assets that are 76% larger than those of organizations led by Black leaders. I mean, imagine that. Like that inequity is dramatic. And unrestricted reserves are what allow organizations to hire a new person if they want to expand a program, to come up with innovation, to try a pilot project, to hire a part-time staff person if one of their staff goes on maternity leave. Like all these things are like they fuel the health of an organization. So I would say just check some of those biases around like things that are perceived as red flags that are actually the signal that maybe that organization is more worthy of support. And yeah, I probably have more to say, but I'll just pause there.
Incredible. I found this so informative. I am sure many others on the call did too. I wish we had more time. We're already 7 minutes over. We have some really helpful nuggets to take with us into our next grant making process. And I hope those that aren't members of Impact Austin that are on this call also can take these back to your corporations, to your organizations as practices to consider as we assist our community. So thank you so much, Shaady and Tyeshia and Lorene, for moderating, to all of you for being so gracious with your time and wisdom in this topic area. I know folks may want to continue the discussion, and we're doing an Impact Austin 101 with Christina. The breakout session rooms are taking place now, so feel free to scan the QR code here. This is for a breakout session with Christina and Robin Crum. And stay with us. Otherwise, stay safe, stay warm, and we'll see you at the next Discovery Days session.
Hi, everyone.